The midnight air was thick with a tense stillness as Jamal Reed stepped into the shadows, blending seamlessly with the dark alley walls of Brooklyn's downtown district. It was a quiet hour, but the tension simmered in the air, the kind of electric unease that made his skin prickle. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled, but every fiber of his being was on high alert. To any passerby, he was just another guy in a worn jacket and jeans, eyes downcast, hands casually tucked into his pockets, exuding a natural blend of cautiousness and familiarity with his surroundings. But to those who looked closer, Jamal Reed was far from an ordinary face in the city. Jamal was deep undercover, a DEA agent navigating the murky world of street-level corruption, the same place he'd been embedded for the last 6 months. Working in silence, hiding behind a constructed persona, he was building a case against a drug ring that extended from corner hustlers all the way up to a small cadre of officers within the local precinct who had not only accepted bribes but were deeply entangled in the distribution network. Tonight, like many other nights, he was here to meet a contact who had promised to tip him off about the latest batch of narcotics moving through the district. It was a chance he couldn't miss, even if every nerve inside him warned him of the risks. As Jamal leaned back against the rough brick wall, his thoughts drifted briefly to the life he'd put on pause for this mission. His family, his friends, his identity, they were all kept carefully hidden behind layers of aliases, fake jobs, and untraceable phone numbers. It wasn't easy, but Jamal's commitment to his work went beyond personal comfort. He believed in his role, felt it to his core. He wanted to see justice, to root out the corruption that had tainted the city he'd grown up in. This was more than a job, it was a calling. The last few months had exposed him to more of the city's underbelly than he'd ever known, even growing up in the area. He'd witnessed the way officers, men and women meant to serve and protect, used their badges like shields, hiding behind authority to exploit the very people they were paid to defend. He'd seen innocent people framed for crimes, brutalized in alleyways, and threatened into silence, all because they happened to cross paths with corrupt officers or had the wrong skin color at the wrong time. Each incident only hardened Jamal's resolve, fueling the fire within him. But tonight, as he scanned the alley's entrance, he noticed something unusual: a patrol car creeping down the street. Its headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating parts of the empty alleyway in flickering intervals as it drew closer. Jamal tensed, his heart pounding with a cautious rhythm. He knew the routines well by now and recognized when something was off. This was a late hour for patrols in this part of town, especially one moving so deliberately. Instinctively, he lowered his head further into his jacket, keeping his profile unassuming and inconspicuous. The car rolled to a stop just across the street. Jamal shifted his weight, preparing for whatever was to come. He wasn't expecting trouble tonight, but he also knew that things rarely went according to plan. Just as he prepared to step further back into the shadows, the patrol car's door opened, and 2 officers emerged. They exchanged a quick look, one nodding in Jamal's direction, as if they were sharing some unspoken understanding. The 2 officers were an odd pairing at first glance. One of them, Officer Gray, was older and exuded the kind of aggressive authority that demanded obedience without question. He wore a hardened expression, his posture exuding power. The other, Officer Lopez, was younger, with a nervous energy about him, constantly glancing at his partner as though looking for approval. "Hey," Gray's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and unyielding. Jamal didn't react at first, but Gray wasn't the kind to be ignored. "You there. Hands where I can see them." A part of Jamal's training taught him not to react too quickly in situations like this. Instead, he moved slowly, letting his hands rise to show he meant no harm, his demeanor calm yet cautious. "Is there a problem, officer?" Gray and Lopez exchanged another look, and Jamal caught a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, or maybe just annoyance that crossed Gray's face. Either way, it was clear the officers had their minds made up. They were going to turn this into something. "Got a call about a suspicious individual hanging around here," Gray said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him. Jamal could feel the weight of his stare, the calculating eyes of a man who'd made up his mind long before he approached. "And you fit the description." "I was just waiting for a friend," Jamal replied, keeping his voice level and steady. He knew better than to reveal any agitation, but he could sense that Gray wasn't interested in his explanation. From Gray's expression, it was clear he'd already decided who Jamal was and why he was here. It didn't matter that Jamal was undercover or that he had DEA credentials tucked away in his pocket to Gray. He was just another black man in a dark alley, automatically suspicious in his eyes. Gray took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. Waiting for a friend, huh? Doesn't sound like the kind of friend you'd meet in an alley at this hour. Jamal bit back his frustration, fighting to keep his expression neutral. I don't see any harm in that. I haven't done anything wrong. Yeah, we'll see about that. Gray smirked, casting a quick glance at Lopez, who appeared visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge his partner. Let's just make sure you're clean. Don't mind if we have a quick look in your car, do you? Jamal felt a jolt of alarm ripple through him, though he didn't let it show. A car search would lead them to nothing but the gear he needed for his undercover role, but this wasn't about finding evidence. He knew well enough what these kinds of searches were about: intimidation, asserting control, making a person feel small, and if the officers were crooked, as he suspected, it could lead to something even worse. I'd prefer if you didn't, Jamal said, his voice even but firm. I've got nothing to hide, but there's no reason for a search. I'm just here, waiting for someone. Gray's smirk twisted into something darker, more dangerous. Oh, don't you worry, we'll get to the bottom of it. Besides, we're just doing our jobs, keeping the streets safe. As Gray moved to step closer, his hand resting casually near his holster, Jamal took a deep breath, his mind racing. He'd been in tense situations before, but this was different. These weren't suspects or criminals he was dealing with. These were cops, and they were operating under the veil of authority. Here, his training felt almost like a burden. He had to remain calm, keep his composure, and play the part of an unassuming citizen. Gray finally stopped mere inches from Jamal, his face twisted in a sneer. Let's make this simple. You either let us have a look, or we take you in for obstruction. Your call. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to relax. He knew he had no choice. The last thing he wanted was to compromise his cover or escalate the situation into a full-blown confrontation. All right, he said quietly, stepping aside, have a look. Gray nodded to Lopez, and the younger officer moved toward the car with reluctance, his eyes darting between Jamal and Gray as though second-guessing the decision. Jamal watched as Lopez fumbled with the door handle, glancing back at Gray for approval, his unease clear. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest as he waited, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, that tonight was about to spiral out of control. And as Lopez began searching the car, pulling aside papers, moving floor mats, his hands stopped for a brief second, then resumed, as if nothing was there. The cold blue and red lights from the squad car cast an eerie glow across the narrow alley. Jamal stood with his hands raised slightly, watching Officer Gray and his younger partner, Lopez, as they circled his car like vultures. He forced himself to keep his breathing steady, mind racing as he prepared for the worst. Although he had been in his undercover role for months, working deep in a gritty network of drug traffickers and crooked city officials, this was the closest he had come to exposure. Tonight, under Gray's intense scrutiny, his cover felt paper-thin. He reminded himself of the stakes. Any slip up here could unravel his entire operation and put him, and the life he had carefully built around this case, in jeopardy. If Gray and Lopez became suspicious, they might dig too deep, and things could get dangerous fast. These officers weren't average patrol cops, they were the very types he was investigating, rumored to have their hands in the city's most lucrative drug pipelines. They were known for targeting minorities, using their positions to intimidate, harass, and exploit their power. And now, for whatever reason, Jamal was their target. Jamal glanced over at Officer Lopez, who was rifling through the glove compartment, his nervous energy evident. Gray, on the other hand, seemed to relish every second of the encounter, watching Jamal like a hawk. His eyes were filled with a quiet but lethal hostility, the kind Jamal had seen before in people who carried a deep-seated prejudice, hidden just beneath a professional veneer. Tonight, Gray had clearly decided Jamal was guilty of something, and he was determined to find proof by any means necessary. So, what kind of friend are you waiting for out here? Gray asked, his tone laced with sarcasm as he leaned closer to Jamal. His breath smelled faintly of stale coffee, and his hand hovered near his holster, a subtle reminder of who held the power. Jamal kept his face neutral, refusing to give Gray the satisfaction of a reaction. Just a friend. I'm not causing any trouble, officer. Gray scoffed, clearly unimpressed. Funny thing about that, guys who aren't causing trouble don't usually get found lurking around these parts late at night. Tell me, you sure you're not holding anything? No, Officer Jamal replied, his voice even. I'm clean. Just waiting, like I said. Gray's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. He turned toward his partner, who had moved to the back seat, carefully combing through the fabric with more reluctance than enthusiasm. Anything yet, Lopez Gray barked, his impatience flaring. Lopez looked up, hesitating as he shook his head. No, nothing here, Lopez replied, shifting uncomfortably. It was clear he wasn't fully on board with Gray's relentless approach, but his loyalty to his partner and the force kept him compliant. Jamal couldn't help but notice the way Lopez's gaze flickered between him and Gray, his unease growing more evident by the second. Gray's expression soured, but he covered it with a smirk, stepping back and adjusting his belt. Well, then he said, drawing out his words, let's just make sure we haven't missed anything. He reached into his own pocket, his movements precise, almost practiced. Jamal felt his stomach twist as he watched Gray's hand reappear, clutching a small bag filled with a white, powdery substance. It took only a fraction of a second for Jamal to realize what was happening. Gray didn't find that bag in his car. He'd brought it with him, ready to frame him. Hey, Jamal's voice came out sharper than he intended, the sudden adrenaline fueling his reaction. But he caught himself, reining in his anger. This wasn't the time to lose control. He took a breath, forcing his voice to calm. What do you think you're doing? Gray grinned, a predator toying with its prey. Just doing my job, pal, he said, holding up the bag for Lopez to see. Looks like our friend here wasn't as innocent as he claimed. Lopez's eyes widened slightly, but he kept silent, glancing at Jamal with a mix of guilt and reluctance. Jamal could tell Lopez hadn't signed up for this, at least not to this extent, but whatever reservations he might have had, they weren't strong enough to push him to speak out. You're planting evidence, Jamal said evenly, though his blood was boiling. You can't do this. Gray's grin only widened, his expression dripping with smug satisfaction. Is that so? Because last I checked, you don't make the rules around here. We do. He tossed the bag to Lopez, who caught it awkwardly, holding it like a foreign object. Jamal had seen men like Gray before, officers who didn't see themselves as public servants, but rather as enforcers who operated above the law. They were the ones who gave the badge its worst reputation, the ones who would do anything to maintain control, to keep their egos fed and their authority unchallenged. But tonight, Jamal had to tread carefully. He had to remember his mission. The bag of drugs now sat on his car's back seat, a planted piece of evidence that could ruin everything. He knew if he reacted too strongly, too quickly, he might break his cover, but he also knew he couldn't let this go unchecked. He forced himself to keep his voice steady as he looked at Lopez, hoping to reach whatever was left of the younger officer's conscience. You know this isn't right, Jamal said, his eyes locked on Lopez, hoping to reach him. You don't have to go along with this. Lopez swallowed, visibly uncomfortable, but Gray stepped between them, blocking Jamal's line of sight. My partner here doesn't need advice from the likes of you, Gray sneered. You can save your speeches for someone who cares. Gray gestured for Jamal to turn around, reaching for his handcuffs. Jamal's heart pounded as he considered his options. The weight of his undercover badge pressed against his chest, hidden under his jacket. He knew he could reveal himself right now, end the charade, and blow his cover, but that would cost him months of work, putting not only this case but his safety at risk. So he took a deep breath, doing what he could to stall, to buy time, hoping to somehow turn this encounter to his advantage. You're making a mistake, officer, he said, choosing his words carefully. You really don't know who I am, do you? Gray's hand froze mid-air, just inches from Jamal's wrist, his expression shifting to one of suspicion. What's that supposed to mean, he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. Jamal met his gaze, his calm exterior masking the churn of thoughts and emotions just beneath the surface. Let's just say you're going to regret this, he let his words hang in the air, watching the faint flicker of doubt flash in Gray's eyes. Lopez looked between them, clearly sensing the tension and uncertainty that Jamal's words had stirred up. He glanced down at the bag of drugs in his hand, his expression one of growing discomfort. Maybe we should ... Check his ID again, Lopez ventured hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Gray shot him a look of pure disdain. And why would we need to do that? We're in control here. His voice was cold, final, a reminder to Lopez of who held the power. But even as he said it, Jamal could sense that Gray's confidence had been slightly rattled. Jamal held his ground, his gaze unwavering as he faced Gray. You're in way over your head, and when the dust settles, I guarantee you won't be the one coming out clean. Gray's jaw tightened, his face flushing with barely concealed rage. For a moment, Jamal thought he might lunge at him, but Gray stopped himself, letting out a short, humorless laugh. You think you're scaring me? He scoffed, though there was an edge to his voice. You're just another punk caught with his hands dirty. No one's going to believe a word you say. Jamal didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on Gray's. He let a slight smile cross his lips, a subtle sign of defiance. Believe me, there are people who will. Gray's face twisted in frustration, his hand flexing around the cuffs. He was teetering on the edge, and Jamal knew he was close to pushing him over. But Lopez's uncertain voice broke the tension. Maybe ... maybe we should let him go, Lopez stammered, looking at Gray with a pleading expression. I mean, we got no real reason to hold him. Gray shot him a glare that could cut steel, but Lopez stood his ground, fidgeting under the weight of his partner's gaze. For the first time, Jamal saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn the situation in his favor. But before he could push further, Gray straightened, his expression hardening into a mask of cold authority. He shoved the cuffs back into his belt and grabbed Lopez by the shoulder, steering him toward the squad car. We're done here, he said, his voice icy. Let's go. As they moved away, Jamal felt a surge of relief tempered by lingering unease. He knew tonight had only scratched. The city's quiet felt tense, as if it were aware of the pressure simmering just beneath the surface. Jamal Reed's footsteps echoed softly along the nearly deserted street, his mind whirring with everything he'd just witnessed. Gray and Lopez had crossed a line, violating not just their oath as officers but their basic moral duty. Jamal knew that kind of corruption existed. He'd trained for it, read case files about it, but experiencing it firsthand hit differently, with a visceral weight that only strengthened his resolve. As he slipped into the shadowed entrance of his rented apartment, Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his burner phone and quickly dialing his DEA handler, Agent Sarah Whitaker. The familiar number brought a small measure of comfort. Sarah was his only connection to the outside world and the person he trusted most in this tangled web of deceit and danger. Jamal, is that you? Sarah's voice was clipped, controlled, but Jamal could hear the tension hiding beneath her tone. Yes, it's me. We have a situation, Sarah. He paused, letting his words sink in, knowing she'd understand the gravity of a call at this hour. What happened? She asked immediately, not wasting time on small talk. Gray and Lopez. They're worse than I expected, Jamal said, his voice low but steady. They planted drugs on me tonight, Sarah. They're the ones we've been looking for. They're tied into this mess up to their necks. There was a pause on the line, a sharp intake of breath. Are you sure? That's huge, Jamal. Do you have proof? Not yet, he admitted, clenching his jaw in frustration. But tonight's encounter was just the start. They're desperate, and I know they'll make another move. Gray's got that look, the type who won't stop until he feels like he's gotten what he's owed. I need to get closer, expose how deep their ties go. There's no way they're working alone. He could hear the wheels turning in Sarah's mind, her years of experience weighing the risks and rewards of the next steps. If they're as involved as you say, this might be our only shot to take down the entire network. But Jamal, you're walking a dangerous line. If Gray suspects even for a second who you really are. I know, Jamal replied quietly. But we didn't come this far to turn back now. This is exactly what we were looking for, the proof that this precinct is rotten to its core. I'm staying in. Sarah's hesitation was palpable, but she knew better than to argue with Jamal when his mind was set. All right, she finally said, but I'm keeping a close watch on you. The moment things get out of hand, I'm pulling you out. You understand? Understood, Jamal replied, though they both knew it wouldn't be that simple. Once he was in, pulling out wasn't just a matter of flipping a switch, it was a game of survival, timing, and luck. As the call ended, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose settling over him. Tonight's encounter had given him an edge. Gray and Lopez had exposed themselves, showing just how low they were willing to go to protect their secrets. He knew that Gray wouldn't let tonight go so easily. His pride had been bruised, and men like him didn't forget slights. Gray would be back, and this time he'd come with even fewer scruples. The following day, Jamal stuck to his usual routine, knowing that any change in his behavior could tip off Gray or his network of associates. He spent the afternoon at a local gym, where many of the guys on the street corner congregated to lift weights, shoot hoops, or simply hang out. Jamal's undercover persona was that of a local with minor criminal connections, a background that gave him plausible reasons to interact with the underbelly of the city without raising too many questions. As he lifted weights in the far corner of the gym, he spotted Gray's unmistakable figure entering through the back door. Clad in his uniform, Gray looked like he was on official business, though Jamal knew better than to trust appearances. The officer's gaze swept over the gym's occupants, his eyes sharp, scanning, until they landed on Jamal. Gray's face twisted into a slight sneer, a hint of recognition flaring in his eyes as he approached. "Reed," Gray said, his tone dripping with feigned casualness as he leaned against the wall. "Funny seeing you here." "Officer Gray," Jamal replied, giving a polite nod, maintaining his cover. "Something I can help you with." Gray's expression remained guarded, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Jamal. "Just making the rounds, keeping an eye on things. Don't want any more. Incidents like last night, you know." Jamal could feel the underlying threat in Gray's words, the silent reminder that he hadn't forgotten their encounter in the alley. But he refused to give Gray the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. "Last night was just a misunderstanding," Jamal said evenly. "I was just minding my business, and you. Well, you were doing your job, right?" Gray's smirk faltered for a split second, and Jamal saw a flash of something darker lurking beneath his calm facade. "You could say that. But sometimes our job requires us to be a little proactive. Can't let the wrong types get too comfortable, or they start thinking they own the place." Jamal kept his expression neutral, his hands gripping the weights just a little tighter. "I understand, officer. You're just looking out for the community, right?" Gray leaned in, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "Exactly. And as long as you keep your nose clean, you won't have to worry about us looking too closely." But slip up, he let the words hang, the implication clear. Jamal fought the urge to respond, knowing that any hint of defiance would only provoke Gray further. Instead, he nodded curtly, keeping his tone calm. "Understood. I've got no plans to make trouble, officer." Gray seemed satisfied with his response, pushing off the wall and straightening his uniform. "Good. I'd hate to see things go south for you. This city's got enough troublemakers as it is." With one last glance, Gray turned and strode out of the gym, his presence leaving a lingering tension in the air. Jamal watched him go, a mixture of anger and determination simmering beneath his calm exterior. Gray's warning had only confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't just a rogue cop operating on his own whims. There was a structure here, a chain of command in the precinct that allowed officers like Gray to operate with impunity. Once Gray was out of sight, Jamal let out a slow breath, grounding himself. He knew he needed more than a simple confrontation to bring Gray and his associates down. He needed proof, solid evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. And the best way to get that was to dig deeper, to find a way to get close enough to Gray and his network without setting off any alarms. As he left the gym that evening, Jamal's mind raced with plans. He would need to find a way to shadow Gray without arousing suspicion, to track his movements and uncover the inner workings of his operation. And most importantly, he needed a way to protect himself in case things went south. For now, he had one advantage: Gray had no idea who he was truly dealing with, a mistake that Jamal planned to exploit to the fullest. But he couldn't afford to make a single misstep. One slip-up could blow his cover, and he knew that Gray and his crew wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat to their operation. As night fell over the city, Jamal prepared himself for what lay ahead. The stakes had never been higher, but he was ready. This was the moment he'd been trained for, the culmination of months of work, and he was determined to see it through. Gray and his network were about to learn that Jamal Reed wasn't just another nameless target on the street. He was their worst nightmare. The air felt thick as Jamal made his way through the bustling crowd gathered in the dimly lit bar that night. The place was packed, filled with men exchanging hurried conversations, friends laughing over drinks, and shadowed figures lurking in corners, each lost in their own world. But Jamal had a singular focus, finding out as much as he could about Officer Gray's network without drawing attention to himself. This bar, known to locals as the Blue Line, was notorious for being a hangout spot for cops who bent the rules and sometimes broke them. Jamal knew he was pushing the limits by coming here. If Gray or any of his colleagues recognized him, they'd get suspicious fast. But he needed information, and this was the best place to find it. He blended into the crowd, his expression set in a casual, disinterested mask as he took in his surroundings. From his vantage point near the entrance, he could see a few men in uniform scattered throughout the room, talking in hushed tones, their eyes scanning the room with the wary vigilance that came from years of working the streets. As Jamal ordered a drink, his attention was drawn to a group of officers seated at a table in the far corner. He recognized one of them as Officer Lopez, Gray's reluctant partner from the night before. Lopez looked uneasy, his shoulders hunched as he listened to a burly officer seated across from him. Jamal didn't know the other officer's name, but his intimidating stature and the way the others deferred to him suggested he held some sway within their circle. Straining to hear, Jamal sidled closer, using the crowd as cover as he inched toward their table. The snippets of conversation he caught were laced with tension, hints of something bigger brewing beneath the surface. "Gray's taking it too far," Lopez muttered, his voice barely audible. "He's pushing things, and one of these days it's going to blow up in his face. You saw what he did last night." The burly officer, whom Jamal now guessed was Sergeant Mason, frowned, his expression hardening. "Gray's methods may be extreme, but he gets results. If we start questioning every move he makes, we're only weakening ourselves. And you know what happens when people start asking too many questions." Lopez's jaw clenched, his discomfort visible even from where Jamal stood. "But it's getting out of hand. Planting evidence, roughing up people who don't deserve it. It's only a matter of time before we get caught." Mason leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Keep your mouth shut, Lopez. You've been in this game long enough to know how it works. We protect each other. Gray may be rough around the edges, but he's one of us. And if he's in trouble, we're all in trouble." Lopez looked down, his shoulders slumping as he absorbed Mason's words. Jamal could see the conflict written on his face, the way his conscience battled against his loyalty to his fellow officers. For a moment, Jamal felt a pang of sympathy for the young officer. He could tell Lopez hadn't signed up for this level of corruption, but now he was in too deep to back out. Suddenly, Jamal felt a hand clap on his shoulder. His heart lurched, but he forced himself to remain calm, turning to see a tall man with a grizzled beard grinning at him. The man was older, dressed in a faded leather jacket and a baseball cap, and his grip was firm, almost painfully so. "Haven't seen you around here before," the man said, his tone friendly but laced with suspicion. "Just stopping by for a drink," Jamal replied, matching the man's easy demeanor while keeping his guard up. He could feel the man's sharp eyes sizing him up, assessing every detail of his appearance and behavior. The man's grin widened, though his gaze remained cold. "You don't look like the regular type that comes here. You sure you're in the right place?" "Depends," Jamal said with a casual shrug. "I go wherever the drinks are cheap and the people mind their own business." The man chuckled, releasing his grip. "Well then, you might just fit in." He jerked his thumb toward a table in the corner. "Name's Charlie. If you're looking to make some connections, I suggest starting with the group over there." Jamal forced a polite smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thanks for the tip, Charlie." Charlie tipped his cap before ambling off, his eyes lingering on Jamal a moment longer than was comfortable. Once he was gone, Jamal let out a quiet breath of relief. That was close, a little too close. He couldn't afford to draw attention, especially not here, where one wrong move could jeopardize everything. Steeling himself, Jamal moved closer to Lopez and Mason's table, catching the tail end of their conversation. "I'm telling you, this whole operation's got a shelf life," Lopez said, his voice barely a whisper. "One slip up, and it's over." Mason's expression darkened. "Then don't slip up. Gray knows what he's doing, and if you want to keep your badge, I suggest you follow his lead. Unless you'd prefer to explain to the higher-ups why you couldn't handle the heat." Lopez's face paled slightly, but he nodded, his resignation evident. Jamal watched as the group disbanded, Lopez trailing behind Mason like a chastised child. It was clear that Lopez was in over his head, trapped by a system he didn't have the strength to fight. But Jamal knew he couldn't count on Lopez's remorse to bring Gray down. He'd have to do it himself. As the group dispersed, Jamal slipped out of the bar, blending into the darkness outside. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside, but his mind remained focused, calculating his next move. He had heard enough to know that the corruption extended beyond Gray, and Lopez Mason's veiled threats made it clear that this was an organized effort, with layers of protection shielding the officers involved. And if Mason was willing to defend Gray's actions so adamantly, it meant that whatever they were hiding went far deeper than Jamal had anticipated. He had hoped to find a weak link in their chain, someone who could be persuaded to talk or provide evidence, but tonight had confirmed that Gray's network was as tightly knit as ever. Lopez was the closest thing to a liability, but Jamal doubted he had the courage to turn against his comrades. The fear in Lopez's eyes was a reminder of the power Gray and his associates held, a power that silenced dissent and crushed any hint of resistance. Jamal's burner phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He checked the screen. It was a message from Sarah. Update. He quickly typed a response. They're protecting each other. Gray's not acting alone. This goes deeper than we thought. The reply came almost instantly. Careful. Don't push too hard. Jamal knew she was right. As much as he wanted to bring Gray and his allies down, he couldn't afford to rush. One wrong move could blow his cover, turning him from an undercover agent into just another target. But he also knew that waiting too long could cost him his chance to gather the evidence he needed. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Gray and his network might have the advantage now, but Jamal had one thing they didn't: patience. He could wait, watch, and strike when they least expected it. The tangled web of corruption would eventually collapse under its own weight, and when it did, he'd be there to expose every ugly detail. For now, he'd play along, keeping his head down and his eyes open. Gray and his associates thought they were invincible, hidden behind a wall of silence and loyalty. But they hadn't counted on him, and that would be their downfall. The following week passed in a haze of tension and careful planning. Jamal had been lying low, gathering information as carefully as possible without rousing suspicions. After his encounter with Mason and the reluctant Officer Lopez at the Blue Line, Jamal knew that he was dealing with more than just isolated cases of corruption. This was an organized ring, and Gray wasn't its only leader. In fact, it was clear now that Mason was pulling strings, overseeing Gray and other officers who were in on the scheme. This wasn't just about drugs, it was about money, power, and a city deeply infected by those who swore to protect it. Jamal sat in his darkened apartment, a faint street light from outside casting slivers of light across his worn-out desk. On the desk lay his burner phone, a few notepads filled with details he had scrawled over the past few months, and the recording device he had carefully hidden in his jacket for his trips to the gym, the Blue Line, and other places where Gray and his crew frequented. The recordings were small pieces of a larger puzzle, conversations filled with bravado, threats, and a sense of invincibility that infuriated Jamal. Each word, each snippet of Gray or Mason's voice speaking carelessly about cleaning up the streets or taking care of business, felt like a new thread he could use to pull their network apart. But today was different. Jamal knew it was time to stop gathering pieces and start setting the trap. He had spent the past 2 days coordinating with Sarah, outlining a plan that would catch Gray, Lopez, and Mason in an inescapable snare. Sarah had managed to pull some strings, sending a team that would be stationed nearby, ready to intervene when Jamal gave the signal. It was risky. One slip could expose him or the team, but it was the best shot they had. The operation was clear: create a controlled sting where Gray and his associates would attempt to make an illegal deal, catch them in the act, and secure irrefutable proof that would unravel their entire network. The hardest part was luring Gray into the trap. After the alley incident, Gray had been cautious, keeping his distance, even when their paths crossed at the gym. But tonight, Jamal had arranged a meeting with a low-level contact in the drug scene, someone connected enough to be on Gray's radar but small-time enough not to pose a real threat. Jamal's plan was to make it look like he was cutting a deal for a large sum of cash in exchange for protection. From the cops, a bribe that Gray, Lopez, and Mason would intercept and attempt to take for themselves. The setup was simple but calculated. Jamal would be in a deserted parking lot behind an old warehouse, the perfect place for a deal that needed privacy. His contact, Richie, was in on the plan. He would play his part, exchanging a hefty envelope of cash with Jamal in a way that looked authentic. Sarah's team would be nearby, their hidden cameras and audio equipment capturing every detail. The clock read 11:45 p.m. As Jamal checked his watch one last time, his mind and body ready, dressed in his usual street clothes that he'd carefully curated to blend into the scene, a loose, dark hoodie, jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He slid his burner phone into his pocket and made his way to the warehouse district. The warehouse loomed like a dark monolith under the night sky, its structure skeletal and foreboding. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few abandoned cars that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. Jamal's footsteps echoed softly on the cracked pavement as he scanned the area. He spotted Richie's car, an old sedan with a single flickering headlight, parked near the back entrance of the warehouse. The air was thick with anticipation, every nerve in Jamal's body alert, his mind hyper-focused. He approached the car, where Richie was waiting, his eyes darting around nervously. Richie was a jittery man with sharp features and a thin frame, the kind of guy who'd been around the scene long enough to know trouble when he saw it. Jamal had worked with him enough times to know he could handle a setup, but the man's anxiety was palpable. "Yo, Jamal, you sure about this?" Richie whispered, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. "I mean, Gray's not exactly the kind of guy you want to mess with." "Stick to the plan," Richie Jamal replied in a low voice, keeping his gaze steady. "I'll handle Gray. Just do your part and everything will be fine." Richie nodded, swallowing hard as he reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope, a thick, padded one that looked convincingly heavy with cash. Jamal took it, holding it in plain view as he handed Richie a small package in exchange, a decoy filled with worthless scraps meant to look like a batch of drugs. They stood there in silence, waiting for the next move. Jamal's ears strained to catch any sign of movement, the faintest noise that would signal Gray's arrival. And then he heard it, the faint crunch of gravel, the distant hum of an engine. Jamal's pulse quickened as he saw a pair of headlights rounding the corner, illuminating the parking lot in a harsh glow. The squad car rolled to a stop a few yards away, and Jamal could make out the figures of Gray and Lopez in the front seat. As they got out, Gray's smug, predatory grin was unmistakable. Lopez followed, his face pale, a sheen of sweat visible under the streetlight. Jamal could see the apprehension in Lopez's expression, the reluctance etched into his every step. But Gray was all confidence, his hand resting near his belt, his posture radiating authority. Well, look who we have here," Gray sneered, his gaze shifting from Jamal to Richie and then back to Jamal. "I knew you'd turn up somewhere, Reed. Guess I was right to keep an eye on you." "Officer," Jamal replied, keeping his voice calm, though every muscle in his body was coiled, ready for action. "Just a business transaction. No need to get involved." Gray laughed, a cold, mocking sound that echoed across the empty lot. "Funny thing about business, Reed. In this part of town, all business belongs to me." He held out his hand, palm open, his meaning clear. Reluctantly, Jamal handed over the envelope, keeping his movements slow, calculated. Gray took it, flipping it open to inspect the contents. His grin widened as he thumbed through the bills, the glint of greed unmistakable in his eyes. "Nice haul," Gray murmured, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. He turned to Lopez, jerking his head toward Richie. "Make sure his buddy here understands the cost of doing business without permission." Lopez hesitated, his face twisted with conflict. Jamal saw the brief flicker of resistance in his eyes, but it was quickly snuffed out as Gray's glare bore into him. Lopez swallowed, then moved toward Richie, his stance stiff, mechanical. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." "All right," Lopez muttered, his voice barely audible. Richie held up his hands, fear evident on his face, as Lopez grabbed him by the arm, forcing him down onto the pavement. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he kept his face neutral, waiting for the right moment. Gray turned back to Jamal, a triumphant sneer on his face. "See, Reed, this is how things work around here. You pay your dues and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you stick around." Jamal met Gray's gaze, a spark of defiance flaring in his eyes. "Funny. Because this time I think you're the one who's in over his head." Gray's smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. But before he could respond, the air was split by the sudden blare of sirens, and flashing red and blue lights filled the parking lot. Gray's face twisted in shock, his grip tightening around his belt as he scanned the scene, realization dawning too late. Sarah's team had arrived. Within seconds, a swarm of agents in tactical gear emerged from unmarked vehicles surrounding Gray, Lopez, and Richie. The officers barely had time to react before they were disarmed, forced to the ground, their hands cuffed behind their backs. Jamal remained standing, his expression impassive as Gray's eyes met his, a look of betrayal and fury burning in his gaze. "You set me up," Gray spat, his voice a venomous hiss. Jamal didn't flinch. "You set yourself up, Gray. You and everyone else who thought they were above the law." As the agents loaded Gray, Lopez, and the others into the vehicles, Jamal felt a profound sense of relief mingled with exhaustion. It was over. The network of corruption had been exposed, and soon the city would know the truth. But as he watched Gray being driven away, Jamal knew this was just the beginning. The road to justice was long, and there were still battles to be fought. The silence in the interrogation room was almost tangible, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. Jamal sat across from Officer Lopez, watching him with an intensity that made Lopez squirm in his seat. The officer's hands were cuffed to the table, his usually confident demeanor now crumbling under the weight of what had just happened. The parking lot sting had blown his world wide open, and he was finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Lopez's eyes darted around the room, settling anywhere except on Jamal's face. His breath came in shallow bursts, his shoulders hunched in a posture of defeat. He had been brought in immediately after the sting, whisked into this windowless room while the DA agents dealt with Gray, who had been livid, shouting threats even as he was handcuffed and escorted out. Lopez had remained quiet, a stark contrast to his partner's fury, as though the reality of his situation had finally sunk in. "Look, Officer Lopez," Jamal began, keeping his voice steady and controlled. "I'm going to give you a chance to make this right, but I need you to be honest with me, completely honest." Lopez swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, as though he hadn't slept in days. "Honest," he echoed, his voice shaky. "About what? You've already got everything you need." Jamal leaned forward, locking eyes with Lopez. "We both know there's more to this than just last night. You weren't just a passenger in this mess, you were involved. But I also know you weren't the one calling the shots. Gray was, and so was Mason. This is your chance to come clean, to finally do the right thing." A flicker of hesitation crossed Lopez's face, and Jamal seized the moment, pressing further. "Look, I know you didn't want to be part of this. I saw it in your eyes every time Gray pushed you into something you didn't agree with. You're not like him, Lopez. You still have a choice here." Lopez shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the table. For a moment he sat in silence, wrestling with his inner conflict. Jamal could see the struggle the way Lopez's conscience was battling against his loyalty to Gray, his fear of retribution, and the knowledge that his future hung by a thread. Finally, Lopez let out a shaky sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you what you want to know." Jamal nodded, relieved but cautious. He knew he had to handle this carefully. Lopez was on edge, and any misstep could send him retreating back into silence. "It started a few years back," Lopez began, his tone weary, as though each word was dragging a heavy burden with it. "I was new to the precinct, fresh out of the academy, and eager to do my job. I didn't think it would come to this." Jamal listened intently, nodding for Lopez to continue. "Gray was the first one to approach me," Lopez continued, his gaze distant as he recounted the events. "He was persuasive. Told me that the city was full of bad people, and that we had to take matters into our own hands. At first it was just small stuff, letting certain guys go, looking the other way for minor infractions. But then things started escalating." Lopez's face twisted with regret as he spoke, his voice growing quieter. "Gray introduced me to Mason. That was when I realized this was bigger than just a few favors. Mason was the one running the show, pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was the one making sure the drugs flowed through the city without interference. And anyone who questioned it, they didn't last long." Jamal's jaw clenched as he absorbed Lopez's words. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, painting a picture of a network that extended beyond the precinct, manipulating the system to protect their own interests. Mason had built a machine, a corrupt network that relied on officers like Gray to carry out his orders while keeping up the appearance of authority. Lopez continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. I knew it was wrong. I knew it from the start. But by the time I realized what I'd gotten myself into, it was too late. Mason made it clear that there was no way out. Anyone who tried to leave, they ended up with ruined careers, or worse. Jamal's gaze softened, but he kept his voice firm. You could have left, Lopez. You could have reported this, gone to anyone outside the precinct. Why didn't you? Lopez let out a bitter laugh, a sound filled with self-loathing. Because I was a coward. Because I didn't want to lose everything I'd worked for. Mason and Gray had a way of making it clear that we were all in this together. It was like they brainwashed us, made us believe that we were doing the right thing by keeping quiet, by cleaning up the streets in our own way. Jamal leaned back, giving Lopez a moment to gather himself. He could see the cracks in Lopez's armor, the remorse that had been buried under years of complicity and silence. And while Jamal knew that Lopez was still responsible for his actions, he couldn't help but feel a small pang of sympathy for the man. Lopez was a victim of his own choices, but he had also been trapped by a system that preyed on loyalty and fear. You have a chance now to make a difference, Jamal said, his tone measured. You can help take down Mason and Gray, expose this whole network, and make sure it doesn't happen again. But I need your full cooperation. You're going to testify, provide evidence, and tell the truth. Every detail. Lopez looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. And if I do this, what happens to me? Jamal hesitated, knowing that he couldn't make promises he couldn't keep. I can't guarantee anything, but if you cooperate fully, it'll work in your favor. You'll have a chance to redeem yourself, Lopez. But you need to decide right now if you're willing to take that chance. Lopez's gaze drifted to the floor, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his decision. He knew that cooperating would put him at odds with Mason and Gray, that it would make him a target. But he also knew that he couldn't keep living with the guilt, the knowledge that he had played a role in the corruption that had destroyed lives. After a long silence, Lopez looked up, his expression resigned but determined. All right, I'll do it. I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. I just want to make it right. Jamal nodded, relief washing over him. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. With Lopez's testimony, they would have the evidence needed to expose Mason's entire network, to bring down the system that had festered for so long in the shadows. It wouldn't be easy, there would be backlash, obstacles, and threats, but for the first time, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. As he rose from his seat, Jamal placed a reassuring hand on Lopez's shoulder. You're doing the right thing. It's not going to be easy, but this is your chance to set things right. Lopez nodded, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. I know, and I'll see it through. As Jamal left the room, he felt the weight of his mission lift slightly. The fight wasn't over, there were still battles to be fought, justice to be served. But with Lopez's confession, he knew they had a real shot at dismantling Mason's network and finally bringing justice to the people of the city. The morning sun had barely risen when Jamal arrived at the courthouse. The air was crisp, filled with the kind of stillness that came just before something big. As he walked through the marble-floored lobby, the reality of what he and the DEA were about to do sank in. After months of planning, weeks of preparation, and countless hours spent gathering evidence, today was the day Mason, Gray, and the others would finally be exposed. Jamal's mind raced as he moved through the corridors, replaying every detail of the plan. Sarah had assembled a specialized task force, and they had managed to secure not only Lopez's testimony but also audio recordings and corroborating evidence from other sources. Lopez's confession had opened the floodgates, leading them to records, files, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of Mason's network. The pieces had finally fallen into place, each one a blow to the carefully constructed shield that had protected Mason and his associates for years. Jamal entered the briefing room, where Sarah and a small group of agents were waiting. The room was filled with the quiet energy of controlled anticipation, each agent focused and ready. At the center of it all was a whiteboard covered in names, arrows, and photos, an elaborate diagram showing the web of connections, money transfers, and drug routes Mason had set up. It was a meticulous operation, one that had thrived under the radar until Jamal's investigation had exposed its foundations. Sarah looked up as Jamal entered, her expression one of steely determination. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him. "I've been ready for this since the day I took this case." "Good," Sarah replied, a faint smile of approval crossing her face. "Mason and Gray are going to be in the hearing today. They think it's a routine review, something trivial. They have no idea what's about to hit them." Jamal allowed himself a brief smile, a sense of satisfaction welling up within him. For so long, he'd been forced to watch these men manipulate the system, use their power to exploit and oppress. But today he would finally see them face justice. It was a small victory in the grand scheme, but it was a victory nonetheless. As Sarah went over the final details of the operation, Jamal took a seat at the back of the room, closing his eyes for a moment to steady his nerves. He couldn't afford to be anything but focused today. Mason and Gray were dangerous men, backed by an organization that had protected them for years. Taking them down wouldn't just be a matter of presenting evidence, it would require absolute precision, coordination, and strength. The plan was straightforward but high stakes. Mason and Gray would be attending a closed-door hearing regarding a minor infraction that had been carefully orchestrated by the task force. They would walk into that hearing room with no inkling of what awaited them. Meanwhile, Jamal and the task force would surround the building, ensuring no one escaped, and then move in to make the arrests. Each agent had been assigned to target Gray, Mason, and the handful of lower-level officers who had been identified as co-conspirators. An hour later, Jamal found himself outside the courthouse, standing alongside Sarah and the team. They were dressed in tactical gear, their faces set with the same grim resolve. As the minutes ticked by, Jamal kept his gaze on the courthouse entrance, waiting for the signal that Mason and Gray had entered the building. His heart beat a steady rhythm, his mind focused on the task ahead. Finally, Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Mason and Gray are in position. Everyone, prepare to move." Jamal nodded, signaling to the agents beside him as they moved toward the entrance. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the heightened awareness that came just before an operation like this. Each step brought him closer to the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he would finally see the men responsible for so much pain brought to justice. Inside, the courthouse was quiet, the echo of their footsteps the only sound as they made their way through the halls. The task force split up, each team moving toward their designated targets, closing in from every direction. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself as he reached the door of the room where Mason and Gray were seated. He heard their voices before he saw them, Mason's booming tone punctuated by Gray's smug laugh. They were completely oblivious, talking as though they owned the place, as though they were untouchable. Jamal felt a surge of anger, a reminder of every injustice these men had perpetrated, every life they had ruined for their own gain. With a nod to the agents beside him, Jamal pushed the door open, stepping into the room with his badge held high. "DA. Mason Gray, you're under arrest." Mason's face twisted in shock, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Jamal and the agents surrounding him. "What is this?" he spat, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Shut it," Sarah cut him off, her tone cold and commanding. "You're done. We have enough evidence to put you away for a long time." Gray, who had been seated beside Mason, rose slowly, his expression darkening. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice steady but tense. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jamal stepped forward, meeting Gray's gaze with unflinching resolve. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And it's over, Gray. You're going to pay for what you've done." Mason's face contorted with rage as he glared at Jamal. "You're making a huge mistake," he snarled, his voice filled with barely contained fury. "I've got friends in high places. You think this is going to end with us?" Jamal held Mason's gaze, unperturbed. "You're right, Mason. It doesn't end with you. But it starts with you. And every single person involved in this mess is going down one by one." As the agents moved to cuff Mason and Gray, Jamal watched, his chest tight with a sense of vindication. He had dreamed of this moment, of seeing these men finally held accountable for their actions. And now, as the agents led them out of the room, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a reminder that justice, though often delayed, could still prevail. But as he watched them go, Jamal knew that his work wasn't finished. There would be fallout from this takedown, resistance from those still loyal to Mason and Gray's corrupt network. There would be other battles to fight, other layers of corruption to expose. Sarah joined him as the team gathered outside the courthouse, a hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "We did it, Jamal. It's finally over." Jamal nodded, allowing himself a rare smile. "It's over for now, but there's still more to do." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than anyone else could, Jamal. You brought them down. Whatever happens next, you've made a difference." Jamal took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. He had spent so much time focused on the mission, on uncovering the truth, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the impact of his work. But now, as he looked around at his team, at the agents who had fought alongside him, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. They had dismantled a network of corruption, exposed the truth, and given the people of the city a chance at a fresh start. It wouldn't fix everything, there would still be challenges ahead, and the scars left by Mason and his associates would take time to heal. But it was a start, and for Jamal that was enough. As the team dispersed, Jamal took a moment to stand in the morning light, savoring the feeling of accomplishment. He had done what he'd set out to do, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that there would always be more battles to fight, but for now he allowed himself to enjoy the victory, a reminder that even in a world filled with darkness, justice could still prevail. 2 months had passed since the courthouse takedown, and the city was still reeling from the revelations that had come to light. Every day, new headlines graced the newspapers, detailing the scope of the corruption within the precinct, the network of deals, and the betrayal of trust from officers sworn to protect the public. The investigation, sparked by Jamal's operation, had uncovered evidence implicating dozens of officials, officers, supervisors, and even a handful of prominent figures who had quietly profited from the operation's cover. Jamal sat on a park bench, gazing at the skyline that stretched across the horizon. The city looked different to him now, as if it had changed overnight, and in a way it had. People who had once walked in fear of those who wielded authority were beginning to feel a tentative sense of trust again, their relief visible in the cautious smiles of passers-by and the way they looked at the officers who still patrolled their streets. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. He heard footsteps approaching, and without turning he recognized Sarah's familiar stride. She took a seat beside him, handing him a to-go cup of coffee as they both sat in silence, watching the city come to life with the first light of dawn. "Still can't get used to these mornings, can you?" Sarah said, her voice soft but laced with pride. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think I ever will. But it's good to be out here, to see people feeling safe again." Sarah nodded, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "You did that, Jamal. You made this city a better place. And you exposed something a lot of people thought was untouchable." Jamal's gaze remained fixed on the skyline, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't just me, it was the whole team. Lopez finally found the courage to do what was right, and you believed in this case even when it looked like there was nothing there." "Maybe," Sarah replied, a smile playing on her lips. "But none of it would have happened without you. We all know that." Jamal remained silent, absorbing her words. He had always known that his work as an undercover agent would take a toll on him, that it would demand sacrifices few could understand. And now, as he sat here in the aftermath, he felt both pride and a strange sense of emptiness. He had spent months, nearly a year, undercover, creating a persona, lying to those he encountered, playing the role of someone he wasn't. The truth of his identity had remained hidden, even from those he had grown close to, and the weight of that double life was beginning to sink in. "How's Lopez holding up?" he asked, changing the subject. Sarah sighed, her expression growing somber. "He's adjusting. He testified as we agreed, and it helped a lot. He's been placed in protective custody, though. He's got a target on his back now, but he's trying to make amends." Jamal nodded, feeling a pang of empathy for the young officer. Lopez had made mistakes, serious ones, but he had ultimately chosen to do the right thing. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start, a step toward a path he hoped Lopez would continue on. "What about Mason?" Jamal asked, his tone carrying a hint of steel. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "They're throwing the book at him. Mason's facing a mountain of charges. Conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, drug trafficking, you name it. His reach was deeper than we thought, but with his network exposed, he's powerless now. They'll never let him out again." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Jamal's face, tempered by the knowledge that Mason's imprisonment wouldn't undo the harm he'd caused. The people Mason had hurt, the lives he'd destroyed, all of it lingered in Jamal's mind as a sobering reminder of the cost of unchecked power. But at least now Mason would face the consequences of his actions, confined behind the bars he'd once believed only applied to others. They sat in silence for a few moments, the city sounds gradually filling the early morning air. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice filled with a warmth Jamal hadn't heard in a long time. "So what's next for you?" Jamal exhaled slowly, considering the question. The thought of diving back into another undercover operation felt daunting, but he knew he wouldn't be able to walk away from his work so easily. He'd built his life around the pursuit of justice, and though it was exhausting, it was also his calling. "I'm not sure," he admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I'll take a break. Get out of the city for a while, clear my head." Sarah gave him a knowing look, nodding in agreement. "You deserve it. But when you're ready, we'll have another case for you. One that won't require you to go undercover," she added with a smirk. Jamal laughed, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'll hold you to that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world around them come to life. The city was still scarred, still healing from the wounds inflicted by men like Mason and Gray, but there was a renewed sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Jamal knew that he couldn't single-handedly change the world, but he'd done his part, and for now that was enough. As they finished their coffee, Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert, and she glanced at the screen before rising from the bench. "Looks like I have to get back. But Jamal, thanks. For everything." He nodded, a quiet gratitude reflected in his eyes. "Take care, Sarah, and thanks for always having my back." With a final nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Jamal alone with his thoughts. He remained seated, savoring the moment, letting the events of the past months fade into the background as he focused on the peace of the morning. Eventually he rose, slipping his hands into his pockets as he began walking down the quiet street. He had no particular destination in mind, only a desire to see the city he had fought so hard to protect, to reconnect with the people he had risked everything to help. As he walked, he felt a sense of resolve settle within him. He knew that his work wasn't done, that there were still battles to be fought and injustices to confront, but he also knew that he didn't have to do it alone. There were others, like Sarah, like the team, who shared his commitment, who would stand by him in the fight for justice. Today he would rest, allow himself to enjoy the simple pleasures he had been denied for so long. And tomorrow, when he was ready, he would return to the work he loved, armed with the knowledge that even in a world filled with darkness, there were moments of light, glimmers of hope that made the fight worthwhile. As he walked into the sunrise, his heart felt lighter, his steps filled with purpose. He had faced the worst of humanity, seen the depths of corruption and betrayal, but he had also witnessed courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of those who believed in justice. And for Jamal, that was enough.